So you've been thinking about potentially investing in single family or multifamily, but you have questions of what is the difference between the two and how does funding work when we consider one option or the other. And in today's video, I actually want to cover just that. I want to talk about what single family, multifamily, how does it work, and at what point you go from residential to commercial loan, and what is the difference of obtaining those. So stay tuned. I'm excited to cover that right now. So right here, we're going to have and talk about the single family homes. Now, single family homes is just like it says, it's a unit that basically houses a single family typically. So when we think about that, that's going to be a condominium, it's going to be a house, right? Like one family house. So, you know, whether it's 1 bedroom or 5 bedrooms is irrelevant. As long as it fits one family, that's what considers it a single family. When we go on the multifamily component, we're talking about a building typically, or a group of buildings, in the case of apartments, that house multiple units within each that a family lives. So, for example, I can buy a house that is 3 bedroom, 2 bathroom, or I can buy an apartment building that has 10 3 bedroom, 2 bathroom apartments in it. So that's where the difference kind of comes in, is the number of units that you are purchasing. Now, you can of course purchase 10 single family homes, or you can purchase one apartment building that has 10 units that are about the same size. So when we're thinking about going into single family housing, the benefit of single family housing is that it's typically cheaper. So when we talk about the average cost of a home, and you might have seen some of the posts that I have been doing, or you've been reading in the news, or watching on TV, or wherever you get your information, that the average cost of home in the United States is about $250,000 today. And that's roughly kind of taking the entire continent, because you have to remember, the United States is not that small. Like, it's pretty darn big. For me, living in, you know, Providence, so for me to travel from Boston to Europe is actually quicker than for me to travel from Boston to LA. So you have to keep that in mind when we're thinking and talking about United States and the national price. So they'll take the most expensive cities like New York and Seattle, LA, San Francisco, Miami, right? You can kind of imagine which one those are. And then they'll also take some of the cheaper areas like Cincinnati, Ohio, or Little Rock, Arkansas, Nashville, Tennessee. Those areas as well, kind of combine them all into one and spit out the number that says this is the average price right there. So that's kind of how we get to the average price. When you go to New York City, chances are in New York City, you're not going to find a single family house per se. It's more going to be an apartment. But if you were to go over there, like a single family, anything, you can count on hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars, depending on the location. And then if you go to a smaller town in Utah, for example, you know, the price for a single family home might be, as, you know, on the high end, as low as $80,000 or $120,000. So it's going to depend and vary. But when we talk about the average, that's kind of what the average price is. Now, the cool part about the single family is because it's lower priced, typically the beginning investors get in there because it's easier to afford. Typically, you will need about 20% down, meaning that's your own money, and then 80% is going to be financed. So 80% of it, you're gonna get a mortgage on it. And so for in this instance, where we have a house of $250,000, you will need about $50,000 plus closing costs, which are about 3 to 5% of the price. So just something to keep in mind. But you will put into it, then you will get a loan for the remaining funds. So in this case, it would be $200,000, and then you can get it for, 15 or 30 years. And in another video, I will actually talk about which one makes more sense in my humble opinion and why. So we're not going to cover that today, but I just want to give you a brief overview of kind of what that looks like. So that's kind of how it works. And then what you end up doing is you want to look into this single family home. And if you're doing it for a long-term investment, meaning you're going to hold and rent, you are wanting to get a rent that is going to cover the cost of ownership. So what I mean by cost of ownership, that's going to be mortgage, insurance, taxes, any landscaping or upkeep that you have to do on ongoing and regular basis. So let's assume that all of that is going to cost us, let's say $1,250, so $1,250 per month. What you're looking to rent this for should be greater than $1,250. So for example, let's say that I rent this thing for $1,500, and in that case scenario, I am clearing $250 a month. So not a bad deal when we're thinking about, not doing much of anything in it. Now, these are just example things. People have invested and have been able to clear $1,000 a month or more, depending on what you're able to do, what price you're able to pay, what is the ongoing rent. So there's a little bit of research that is required with all of the real estate, regardless whether it's a single family or multifamily. So that's kind of how the single family thing works. When you are looking at financing a single family, it works very similar to buying your own home. The bank is going to ask you for your job and for the proof of funds and for your history. And so you can imagine every single thing financially they're going to want to know, because even though you're saying, I'm going to use this as an investment, they really could care less. Because the properties like this are considered residential, and so for their purposes, when they're thinking of underwriting and risk assessment and everything else that kind of goes into giving people loans, they really could care less of what you're going to do with it. Sometimes, depending on the lender, they might give you a little bit of a credit per se as far as how much they're willing to loan you, but they will still consider all of the components that you would need to give when you are buying a single family home that you're going to live in, or a secondary home like a vacation house. Now, residential loans are all going to go for 1 to 4 units. That is when it comes to the loans. So loans all the way up, whether I am buying a single family house or I'm buying, say, a duplex, meaning one house that has 2 doors, meaning 2 families can move in, and maybe I can live in one side and rent the other side, which we're going to talk about in one of the upcoming videos of kind of how does all of that work. But I just wanted to share this with you. But for our purposes here, when we talk about single family, we only focus on the one. It really is just that single family, like it's just me and my family and my dog, and nobody else is sharing that house with me, right? I get the yard all to myself, unless it's a shared yard with the neighbors, but that's a different story. So for this purpose, that's kind of what we're looking at. Now, when we talk about multifamily, in this particular case, multifamily is going to be anything from 2 units and up. Now, again, for loan purposes, 1 to 4 units is considered residential, 5 units and up is considered a commercial loan that you're going to need to get. And the game is a little bit different when we talk about that. But on a multifamily, if you're getting anything from 1 to 4 units, from financing perspective, it's going to be exactly the same of your personal work, income that is coming in, and all those different things. The bank will often, if you're getting more than 2 units, look and say, okay, well, I'm going to give you some credit because you're actually, right, you're not going to occupy all 3 units, all 4 units. So I'm going to give you a little bit of credit, what we think is going to rent on the market. So that more comes with the loan and the deal that you're going to get. But predominantly, they want you to have an income. Now, When we go into the commercial component, we are talking 5 units and up. That is the part where your personal income really becomes irrelevant. What they want to know is, do you have any experience in real estate investing whatsoever? Do you have any partners that maybe have that? Do you have the down payment? And can the building itself support the borrowing? So, for example, if I was to purchase, instead of a single family home, I was to buy an apartment building that is costing, say, for example, $2.5 million. And of course, I can then still consider that I would need to pay about 3 to 5% on the closing costs. I can still pretty much safely assume that I'm going to need about 20% down for this, although commercial investing and commercial loans are a bit different and they work a bit different. But the problem is that for vast majority of people, like say that it is 2.5 million and it is 20% down, I would need to come up with $500,000 in cash that I need to put towards one of these and then finance 2 million over the course of 15, 20, 30, sometimes even 40 years. So commercial loans will go as high as 40 years. But of course, there are stipulations and you can't always get those. So that's kind of where the difference is. What I have found in my experience is that getting a commercial loan for multifamily, meaning 5 units and up, is way easier than getting a residential loan that is 1 to 4 units. And silly enough, it's actually, even if you go for a duplex, triplex, or a fourplex, I have found that it's easier to get a loan for those than it is for a single family home. But of course, the more units you have, the price keeps going up, and that's what stops a lot of people. The other difference is that typically, if we're going with the single family home only, some of the maintenance components can be leased out or passed on to the tenant. For example, snow. If you live anywhere where there's snow, like I do, snow has to be removed and you have to, sprinkle the salt and that kind of stuff. If I have a single family home, I can basically in the lease say, hey, you, the tenant, is responsible for your own snow cleanup. You, the tenant, is responsible for your own landscaping and cutting your own grass in the backyard and pruning the trees and doing all of that stuff. In something that is more of a commercial space, or there's like 10 units or 15 units or sometimes even as little as 2 or 3 units, I have to be typically responsible for doing those things. So I have to either myself remove the snow or find somebody that I can hire that will go in and remove the snow and prune the trees and cut the grass and do some of those maintenance components within the common shared areas. Now, I may not need to necessarily go into an apartment unit to change a light bulb, although sometimes that's the case as well. It just depends how you write the lease. But I absolutely do have to go in and change the light bulb in the entryway that everybody's using that lives in that building. So that's kind of where the difference comes in with the amount of work that ends up happening. Now, when we talk about economies of scale, while it's easier to get into single family because of the costs and because of the ease that I only have one person to deal with, and that's typically easier, versus I have 100 people to deal with, which can be much more complex. The difference is also that I can scale up. If we can assume that I get, say, $100 in remaining funds from that cash flow of the rental, right? All of the expenses are paid off, and the difference of all of the expenses from the income that I'm getting from that property is, say, $100. Well, in one house, when I get just a single family, I only get $100 a month. In an apartment building where I get, say, 10 apartments that are renting and I get the $100, now we're talking $1,000 a month. So there's a bit of a difference between the two. Typically, single family homes, you can demand a bit higher rent than you can in an apartment. And typically, although not always, the tenants that live in single family home tend to stay that a bit longer than your apartment dwellers. Often apartment dwellers will stay there for 1 or 2 years, although it is not unheard of that if they're treated well and really like the area and really like the place and location, all of that stuff, that they will stay there for 5, 10, 15, 20, 30 years, sometimes a lifetime. But if we are just looking at averages, single family folks will typically stay there longer. Maintenance on it is a bit easier. Although if you go with the larger unit, you can hire a property manager and truly just be a passive collector of the cash, where you're actually hiring an entire company, entire team to run and operate the whole thing. You could potentially do it with single family as well. The challenge with doing it with single family is that it will eat up in all of your profit, and so you don't have economies of scale to be able to hire that. It's sort of like starting a business, right? Once you have a business that has hundreds of thousands of users, of course you can hire a team of 1,000 people that can like do all this stuff. But when you're just starting out, you can't, because you have to have income coming in to cover the expenses. It's very similar when we're talking about these regards of kind of how that works here. Some of the other things to consider before you decide whether you're going to go with single family or multifamily is the exit strategy. What are you going to do when you decide you no longer want to do this? Sometimes folks are saying, well, you know, my exit strategy is just to keep it for forever. And that's cool. But your exit strategy might be that you want to actually get out of it. Single family homes are typically, although not always, but typically easier to get out of. They tend to appreciate a bit quicker, meaning they go up with the market. And they're easier to get out of because not only can you sell it to an investor, but you can also sell it to an end user, which there's a whole lot more of. That's the benefit of single family homes. You can also maybe sell it to your tenant, where you give them an ability to sort of lease to own, where they maybe pay a bit more in a lease, but a portion of that goes towards the equity, and eventually they have an ability to refinance properties all theirs, and you're able to walk away. When we talk about multifamily, you're really looking for an investor as your only choice. The multifamily typically doesn't appreciate with the market like single family homes would. But what you can do with multifamily is that by renovating and fixing up and doing some of the things, you have an ability to increase that cash flow. And when we do evaluation of the single family versus multifamily, single family, it kind of goes with the market, and there's certain things you can do, but it's very limited. It typically goes with the comps. When we go into large multifamily units, comps have a little bit to do with it, but it's mostly all numbers. Nobody cares about the countertop in the kitchen and the flow of the space and the color of the wall. People look at it for numbers and numbers only. So they will look at things like net operating income, which is basically how much money at the end of the day, when everything is paid off, do you bring in, and what is the cost that I'm getting in. And from there, they will come up with what is known as cap rate, which is sort of that difference of the cost versus the net operating income, and what is that percentage, what is that ratio between the two, and what is typical for this type of property in this particular location. And that's how they look at it. They look at it saying, if I put in $1, how many dollars are going to come out? That is how multifamily is typically evaluated. And when folks are looking to sell, they will typically look at some of the strategic moves around how do I show a larger income, smaller expenses, because now I'm able to raise that cash flow and I'm able to sell it for more money. I hope this was helpful to you when you're thinking about going single family or multifamily. The cool piece is you can make money in either one of those. The bad part is if you don't know what you're doing, you can lose money in all of them. So what I do always recommend is that if you don't know what you're doing, spend time learning and educating yourself, going out there, looking what's on the market, and really starting to consider which of the two strategies make the most sense for you. Thanks for watching, and until next time, stay forever money blessed, and do remember, you are only one deal away. I want you to be happy. Don't you want to be happy? I want to be happy.